Well, standing in College Avenue at the moment, and although this is a much more modern road, behind us, of course, is the fantastic Dell, the house that was built by Alfred Russel Wallace. Well, Victorian Grays was expanding. Originally, of course, it was a very agricultural area, farming. But the centre of Grays had a nice high street and river frontage, which was really important for business. And then suddenly, in 1854, the London Tilbury Southend Railway arrived, and new openings for everybody. And slowly, after that date, you start to see settlement and new housing and new shopping developments increasing. And I think this was the focus that allowed Wallace to come and live here, but get to London quickly. Grays and Thurrock generally has a long history of industrial production, and that's because of the natural geology of gravel and chalk and clay. So behind the Dell are extensive quarries, which have been excavated for the last 200 or 300 years. And ultimately, as Wallace was arriving in the 1870s, we know there were lime kilns, for instance, just behind the house. So it must have been a bit smoky and smelly, but that was just coming to an end because cement, Portland cement, had been invented in that same era, about the 1870s. And indeed, we know that Wallace buys cement, almost certainly from a local company, to build his house. What's also interesting is there's actually quite a big brick industry of Grays, which now, there's not much evidence of. Unless you look at the curtain walls to gardens, you'll see the clinker second bricks being used as walls. But Grays Park, for instance, is the bottom of a clay pit where brick earth was excavated, and millions of bricks were made, yellow stock bricks, which mainly was sold out of the district to London, which was the great purchasing power as London was developing. So a lot of those sort of industries are going on, modifying the landscape. And indeed, it's interesting that Wallace describes his little Welsh valley just behind the house, which is partly natural ravine of the gravel terrace, but also I think modified through quarrying, and we know later on it was modified to make it into a romantic walk and garden areas down the slope. So fascinating landscape history as well as the history of the house itself. But by the time that Wallace arrived to build his new house, the cement industry had arrived in Thurrock, so we had a series of new cement companies digging out clay and chalk, converting it to cement. And Wallace, was one of those people with that scientific mind who thought, well, I can use this new material. And of course, although he employed an architect and everything, but it was one of the first concrete houses to be built. So I think it's quite interesting to see that juxtaposition of new industry, Wallace trying to get to London quickly, new house in a lovely setting on this escarpment that looks over Grays and over the River Thames. Looking this way down College Avenue, of course, this was all open fields. Nowadays it's all housing and the convent. So I think there was actually quite a nice long view, maybe not as far as Tilbury, but I think once he stood in his garden, perhaps on the southern side of his garden, he'd certainly be able to see the River Thames by Grays, and I think looking towards Tilbury he'd see the estuary, the floodplains going out. It was interesting to know that Wallace had of course been travelling before he arrived in Grays, and indeed the time he was here he probably travelled around. But in the gardens, of course, there were some glass houses. He was obviously nurturing plants and carrying all those observations. So it's fascinating to think that one of his books was actually written here, and he would have sat in one of the rooms looking over the gardens and the glass houses where he was nurturing his plants, and actually finished his book, The Geographical Distribution of Animals, a very important world publication, as it turns out to be. One of the drawbacks for Wallace was that he actually travelled to London quite often to meetings and to visit the various museums, and indeed he would visit the Geographical Society in London in Burlington Square, and he would go to the evening lectures. But unfortunately, the evening lecture sort of ended by sort of 10:30, 11 o'clock, and he couldn't travel back to Fenchurch Street in time to get the last train back to Grays, and this seemed to rather peeve him. And maybe with other things going on, he ultimately decided to move house from here, and so we lose sight of Wallace in Grays from that time onwards. The dell, interestingly, was purchased almost immediately by there's 2 or 3 owners we know. The managing director of the Victoria Wine Company was one. Then a local vet purchased it, Mr. Vincent, I think his name was, and indeed I've heard lots of stories about people bringing their animals to the side of the house where the veterinary had his little surgery, and then ultimately it was bought by the convent, and for the last few years the nuns from the convent, retired nuns and active nuns, lived in the nunnery, I suppose you'd call it, but it was the dell. When you look at the whole history of Thurrock, it's a big area. There aren't that many people that you can say who lived here who had world influence. Yes, controversial, but world influence in the sense of his thoughts and his understanding about the science and observations he'd been making about natural selection. So I think he warrants probably the highest grade well, certainly the highest scientist who's ever lived here. Well, I think he'd be shocked by how many houses we have all around us, and the huge convent complex, and the greys, which even in his day there weren't that many houses, and they were very much down nearer to the high street and running up the hill a little bit. Some houses were beginning to come along, but now everywhere seems to have housing. To the bottom of the hill, the dell, all that along there is all housing. The College Avenue has been built, much later on, and this has got housing as well. So I think that would be a shock to him. I think he would have thought that he had lived in the countryside, and now it's an urban area. As part of our museum service in Thurrock, we adopted a scheme, the Blue Plaque scheme, of identifying properties and places where interesting events or interesting people lived. And one of the first that we ever put up in Thurrock under our own scheme, the Thurrock Heritage Plaque scheme, was to Wallace and put up on the dell. And you'll be able to see that if you ever come and visit the house. It's very prominent, and it's really interesting because we actually did have some relatives of Wallace come at the time, so it was lovely to have the family linkage, but also local people, local historians, which have from the local history society, who are fascinated about Thurrock's unique heritage, which many people in Thurrock just walk past and don't notice. So these green plaques are to just enhance that, and people think, perhaps I ought to know a little bit more and to go and read books or visit the society meetings.